Yes, I now have sound effects. Welcome to week 4. And just to liven things up, I have some sound effects to include in my in my lectures now. So every time I do something great, isn't that awesome? I don't need an audience. Okay, back to seriousness there. Let's take a look at week 4 here in Introduction to Psychology. Here we have our timeline from Brightspace. Ooh, I hit the back button by mistake. Here's our timeline, and here down in week 4. Hopefully you've gotten done chapter 3 and that correlation assignment. I didn't receive any questions about that. So hopefully that went well. But here we're entering into states of consciousness. We have 2 discussions and a quiz to go along with that. So states of consciousness is actually one of the more tricky aspects of the human experience that we've been struggling with as psychologists to kind of define, because it's sort of, we don't really understand how all of this neurology and sensations and perceptions and memories and feelings that are all going on at the same time all really sort of come together to create our lived experience of being, awake, and in the other different kinds of consciousness that there are. And we'll be discussing some of those today. So make our way through the course book. Here we have the beginning of chapter 4, and I go into a little soliloquy here about the actual benefits of daydreaming. Now, I'm not talking about daydreaming, for hours on end, but it's actually a way in which to take a cognitive vacation. And studies have indicated that individuals who have that ability to kind of like take a moment and just take a little journey to someplace sunny and warm, or to a chocolate factory or something like that, whatever it is that they want to think about, that moment actually is a rest. Now, let me be clear about the notion of this. Taking a rest from your computer to go to your phone is not the same thing and does not produce the same results. This is an imaginative journey. This isn't like I'm going to go look at pictures for a while and then get back to work. That actually has been shown to have no benefit at all. Whereas if you kind of close your eyes and just take a moment to kind of drift away for a bit, as long as you can come back, you're actually more productive. All kinds of benefits. I go into all kinds of benefits in this part of the course. And interestingly enough, when we talk about abnormal psychology, we're going to be talking about the category of dissociative disorders, which include a number of different diagnoses along a continuum. And that continuum is the ability to dissociate. Really defines the extent to which somebody moves along that. Now, so what I'm saying in terms of the benefits of daydreaming is, in low levels under your control, dissociations actually have benefits. Too much of a good thing creates borderline personality disorder and ultimately identity dissociation disorder. I think that's what it's called now. Used to be multiple personality disorder. And so daydreaming is good, keep it in control, but going off to the phone or going to search the web to take a break from your work, that's not it. You got to go inside and imagine things, and it activates parts of the brain that have been associated with some pretty high levels of productivity. So back to the course book, we have our learning outcomes that we're going here. We're going to define consciousness. We're going to discuss our own circadian rhythms, the built-in clock that we have that is specific to us as animals here on planet Earth. We'll talk about dreaming and dream interpretation, and then ultimately a little quiz having you look at the actual neurological effect of certain drugs, any chemical of kind, whether it's aspirin or whether it's cocaine, all of them have a neurological effect. That's why we use them. Well, I don't use cocaine, but people who use cocaine use it for that reason. Okay, so here we are at the beginning of the chapter, and we kind of wonder, what does it mean to be consciousness, to have consciousness? And it kind of goes back to what I just said at the beginning, and that is consciousness is kind of defined as the collective thoughts, memories, feelings, ideas, expressions, environments, sensation at a given time. That is our current state of consciousness. And here we are introduced to a word in the field of psychology that has another word, and these two words are used to distinguish very important parts of our understanding of the human experience, and that's state and trait. State means, we use the word state to describe things that are fluid and changing and mobile and responsive. So our consciousness is that way. We can be very much concentrated on our work. The little alarm that we have set for our daydream session goes off, and then we can slip very rapidly into that state of consciousness. And so we can switch that very, very quickly. So our state of consciousness is fluid. We use the word trait to describe characteristics that are more enduring regardless of states. So I will be, like, say, personality and intelligence are sometimes, or aspects of intelligence are actually considered intelligent traits. So personality traits, emotional states, states of consciousness, intelligent status. You know, each one of these, we look at those terms, and it's really describing this dichotomy of the understanding of the human experience, where some things rapidly change and are fluid, and some things tend to be consistent across different experiences. So that's really kind of what we're talking about now, is that notion of states, and we're starting with consciousness. Now, the first area we kind of want to look at is the biological aspect of that. Now, as human beings living on Earth, our inner clock is set to the length of our day. So we have a 24-hour day, and a certain portion of that, depending on your latitude, is daylight. We are diurnal animals, meaning we're awake in the day and sleep at night. Nocturnal animals, noc is the word for night. Nocturnal animals are awake all night and sleep all day. But we're set to that clock, and inside of us there are all kinds of regulating systems, including our sleep-wake cycle, that are responsive and dependent on that particular time frame. So in the course book, I have this graphic that sort of shows the changes that happen across the day of a human being here. And let's just start at noon. So at noon, usually people are pretty awake. At 2:30 in general is our best coordination. So if you're going to have basketball practice, nice to have that right after school. 3:30 is our fastest reaction time. Around 5 becomes our greatest cardiovascular efficiency and muscle strength. That's when we are at our peak. At 6 o'clock is our highest blood pressure. Then at 7, highest body temperature. So you can see that kind of prime for the day, that afternoon. We're going to see it in the morning as well when we come around here. And then after 7, right around 9, we get the secretion of melatonin. So melatonin, sorry, that deserves a sound. Really, that bad vocabulary on Dr. Kavanaugh's part there. Melatonin starts secreting. The actual process of that is kind of a fascinating aspect of the brain for me, is that light coming into our retina. Some of our neurons in our retina are there and they don't communicate to our occipital lobe. They actually communicate to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. My favorite part of the brain, just simply because it's fun to say. The suprachiasmatic nucleus sends signals to the rest of the brain to release or uptake melatonin, which is a drug that enters into our bloodstream, and we become sleepy. So it actually causes the part of the brain that is keeping us awake to relax. So our natural state of the brain is asleep. There's a part of the brain that wakes it up, and then that part of the brain is suppressed by the fact of the presence of melatonin. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about there. So back here, we generally fall asleep sometime between 9 and midnight. So here we're sleeping. At 2 a.m. is where we recognize our deepest sleep. At 4:30 a.m., the lowest body temperature, natural fluctuations of body temperature. So if you wake up in the middle of the night, it's 3 or 4:30, you have to take a bio break or something like that, and you're cold, it's not necessarily because the house is cold. It's because your body temperature is the lowest it's been. So being around blankets and whatnot has kept you warm through that. Once you get out of the bed and you have to go across the room, it feels cold. At 6 a.m., coming around here at 6:30 is our sharpest blood pressure rise. Melatonin at 7:30, the melatonin has been decreasing and now it stops completely. And by 10 a.m. we are at our highest alert status. So throughout the cycle of the day, we are going through, you might call them biorhythms or something, although that's really not kind of the accurate term. But each one of us has something like this, slightly modified. Don't be screaming, hey, I'm up until 1 o'clock in the morning. This is the normative developmental way in which people spend their day. However, there is some rigidness to this system. I mean, if you're an individual that has trained yourself to stay up really late at night and sort of almost become a nocturnal kind of person, that is ultimately not going to benefit you. We are significantly diurnal animals, and that kind of lifestyle slowly has its detriments. One of the detriments of that, of course, is an impact on the body's system of fighting off disease, our immune system. And the activation of that, the reason why that has an effect on our immune system, or lack of sleep has an effect on our immune system, isn't because we become weak. What it is in the presence of a disease, there are activating mechanisms that tell the brain that there's an infection. When we are overtired or forcing ourselves with caffeine or whatever to stay up late and work against this biological rhythm, it actually activates the same system in our brain as if it was reacting to an invasive disease like a virus or bacteria. And what we get over time is almost a boy cried wolf effect. When the brain is being constantly told every day that there's this invasion going on, but it's not an invasion, it's actually you trying to stay up late, or you're working third shift or something like that, that over time what happens is your brain becomes less responsive to that signal. And what that means is if you do have an actual viral or bacterial infection, your brain will be less responsive to that. You won't, all the armies of your white blood cells and your entire immune system will not be activated because, it's probably just, Sally's trying to stay up again. And you have your body is less likely to fight it as much as it would if it was on a regular cycle and the brain wasn't always being fooled that these things are going on. So as you go through the book here, there's a movie on consciousness from our friends at Crash Course, some neuroscience about the actual suprachiasmatic nucleus thing. Please watch that video. I think and learn how to pronounce it. That's a very good way to get on my good side. Suprachiasmatic nucleus. Super means above, the chiasm, and the chiasm that they're actually talking about is the optic chiasm, which is where your left eye and right eye cross over and go to opposite parts of the brain. Call that the optic. So it's the supra above the optic chiasmatic nucleus, and that is responding to particular neurons in your eyes that determine your day-night schedule. This is an interesting thing, as our friend Mr. Musk, I forgot his first name for a second, the owner of SpaceX is planning on going to Mars, and Mars has a very different length day, and the first human beings there are going to be in a constant state of sleep deprivation if they're there. So there's some interesting experiment. Long term, there's going to be an interesting experiment if Elon came to me. If Elon ends up going to Mars with his group of people, and their intent is to stay there for the rest of their lives, but if they have children there, will those children become Martians? Will they grow up in a world with the length of day for Mars and adapt to that particular cycle, or will there be a genetic sort of limit coming from Earth that it may take many, many generations for individuals to become naturally Martians? So being a Martian is not just about living there, it's about actually being in sync with that planet instead of our planet. Okay, so let's look at sleep, because that's, of all of the altered states of consciousness that we have, of all the different states, if you say altered states like something else besides being awake, but they're all different states, the most common one that we spend time in, aside from being alert and active, is sleep. We spend up to 1/3 of our life sleeping. It's characterized by low physical activity, a reduced sensory awareness, and there are particularly specific brain patterns that happen as we enter into the different stages of sleep. So stage 1, 2, 3, 4, and REM sleep. REM sleep, where we often see dreaming. So there's some myths about sleep that we want to dispel. Certainly, adults need 7 to 10 hours of sleep. They don't get, you're getting away with it. I get you, I do it too. But there's a cost in that immune system. Now, if you're healthy and you're young and all that, of course, it's way easier to do. It's harder to do that later in life. But actually, in that case, across the lifespan, our actual need for a lot of sleep changes. As well as an infant, we sleep most of the day, and as we age into adulthood, we start to level off at this 7 to 10 hours. The elderly tend to not get enough sleep in general. They tend to have disrupted sleep because of problems with aging and whatever is keeping them up, or anxiety or whatever. Anybody who suffers from anxiety might suffer from not getting enough sleep. But 7 to 10 hours, that's really what our body needs. This is biology. Sometimes our society doesn't really, our jobs and expectations that we have of ourselves, or maybe we take on a lot and we have to use a lot more time to do those things, get in the way. There's a myth that it's healthy that you can just fall asleep anywhere and take cat naps, and those are really not necessarily a healthy pattern, nor the ability to be able to go into sleep that way, because you're really looking at something that's supposed to have a start and end time. 9 o'clock, the melatonin starts to go out. By 7 o'clock, no more melatonin, 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. That's supposed to be our sleep time, not a nap time in the day. That throws off the release of melatonin, all of that stuff. So that's kind of a myth. Your brain and body can adapt to less sleep? No, it cannot. eventually disrupts us. Snoring is mostly harmless. That is not true. Snoring is a relaxing of the upper palate and the tongue in the throat so that they close on each other, and as you breathe, they vibrate and create that irritating noise. And it's actually a very common symptom of sleep apnea. And it's interesting because right now, as I do this video, I took my sleep apnea test 2 days ago, and I'm waiting for the results. So I might end up with a CPAP machine, which is a forced air into my airways that both reduces snoring and keeps me from having periods where I'm not breathing at night, so that I have more restful sleep. That's the apnea. The apnea part of the sleep part is while I'm sleeping. Apnea is I'm not breathing. So sleep apnea, not breathing while I'm asleep. So sleep apnea is a common cause, or it's a symptom that goes along with snoring, and probably should be something you discuss with your doctor. Drinking alcohol before you fall asleep helps you fall asleep. Well, it suppresses your nervous system, but it is also a very poor habit to get in. We want natural chemicals like melatonin to help us fall asleep. Now, usually the effect of alcohol is to get us to stop being anxious. It's a drug that uninhibits our emotions. We're able to relax. We're able to stop thinking about the things that are irritating us. But that's, of course, taking drugs to deal with stress is not a good use of drugs. And so you kind of want to address the core issue of stress associated with your lack of sleep. If you are in bed and you are really having a hard time sleeping, just staying in bed is just going to cause more anxiety. You probably should just get up and do something. They always talk about doing laundry, so you kind of have to keep a load of laundry available for this, right out of the dryer, and just do something really boring. Don't watch TV, don't get on your device. Do something to keep the lights out and just kind of do settling things until you get tired. You want that natural process to happen. It does matter what time that you go to sleep. Just going through all these that are in the book here. Watching TV in bed helps you relax. That's actually not true. The blue light wave that comes out of modern televisions and devices actually is a stimulant in the suprachiasmatic nucleus that makes it wake up. So you're not supposed to do that. Hitting snooze is great. No, probably should get up right away. Those micro sleeps are not benefiting you. Remembering your dreams is a good sign of getting sleep. No, that just means you remember your dreams, and some people don't really remember their dreams very well, and others do. And however, I will say, as a person who does dream analysis, and I'll explain that next. Personally, I do dream analysis, and you can teach yourself to remember your dreams. And there's some procedures like keeping a book next to your table that you can scratch ideas at, because they quickly fade. There's no doubt about that. But in the circles that I used to hang out with other dream interpreters and Jungian perspectives on dream symbolism and whatnot, that there were individuals that woke up in the day and they could recite numerous dreams. They had trained themselves to be able to remember all of their dreams and remembered them quite vividly. So if you're interested in doing work in your dreams, it's going to be important to develop a habit of remembering them. Now, let's talk about this dreaming thing. Now, I'm a scientist, and so I understand the kind of fringe area that dream interpretation occupies in the field of psychology. Now, so throughout history, this altered state of consciousness that we call dreaming that occurs during the brain waves usually associated with rapid eye movement, REM sleep, where the brain doesn't look like it's awake, but it's way more active than in the other stages. And we start to see very characteristic brain waves coming out during REM sleep. throughout history, this is seen as important. Throughout biblical history, dream and dream interpretation leads nations. We have all kinds of folklore about dreams, religious and otherwise, of spirits, of demons, of inner motivations and whatnot. And then along came Freud, and who was the first one to try and like really grapple with this. And he felt that dreams were the way in which the ego attempted to rectify the differences that exist between the id, which is the self-serving part of the personality, and the superego, which is the moralistic and societal-driven aspect of our personality that may be in conflict. I want that candy, but I don't have money, so I can steal it, but it's against my moral values. And how do I resolve that? How do I resolve the anxiety that I feel when I want something that I can't have? And that goes into the unconscious and expresses itself in dreams. And it expresses itself either in a literal dream or in a symbolic dream. Now, when you get into that symbolism, we're really into what we would call depth psychology, which looks at a very significant spiritual or metaphysical component of psychology. We don't necessarily have to buy into that model, however, to benefit from interpretation of dreams, and I want to tell you why. Now, the most straightforward interpretation in science of dreams is called the reaction synthesis system, which is basically the brain is activated during REM sleep, and just as the brain is very adept at looking into the night sky and seeing shapes outlined by the stars, we see patterns where there really are no patterns. We see that, and we have the incredible ability to do that. Our brain is very active in taking this random information and putting it together in some sort of cohesive or non-cohesive storyline. That's what the brain is really good at. Now, from my perspective in terms of interpreting dreams, I can either go down the rabbit hole of thinking that there are spiritual connections to what we're experiencing, and we'll get into this when we talk about personality, when we actually go into depth psychology, that our consciousness is in a shared spiritual realm called the collective unconscious, and that there are archetypes, spiritual archetypes that teach us. It sounds a little woolly, I know, but there are spiritual archetypes that teach us and exemplify how we live our lives on earth, and that we access that realm through the unconscious place of dreams. So those individual creatures that live in this ocean of the collective unconscious had meaning. And that meaning is what the work of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung really explored, is what does it mean to be in a house when you're in a dream? And it has that symbolic meaning. Now, setting that aside for a bit, and we look at the reaction synthesis model and say, okay, the brain's just doing this. We can still ask the question, why did the brain put you in a house instead of a bus in that random? Might there be motivations in the brain? Might there be things the brain is trying to do that took those random, seemingly random signals from the brain and created a house instead of a bus? If there's a difference between our experience with those. So either way, either model that you want, you can still examine dreams as a way of starting a conversation with an individual about things that are going on in their lives. So what I do as a dream interpreter, or someone who likes to do that, is I have people tell me their dreams, and I have a book. It's the Symbols of Dreams, the American Dictionary of Dream Symbols. And its validity really doesn't even matter. If it says, a house is usually a symbol for the person's personality. So as they're walking through the hallways of their house and they're going into rooms, they're actually, the way that we interpret that is they're exploring aspects of their personality. They get to a locked door, hidden part of their personality, all of that. Its validity doesn't really matter because in the practice of dream interpretation, you suggest to the individual, say, I'll look it up, and I kind of just let the dictionary do the talking, and I say, well, the house might mean who you are, and you're kind of exploring aspects of yourself, and then like, okay, let's go with that, and you come up to a locked door, what are you feeling? Well, I'm feeling scared, and what do you think's in the door? And then what can happen by just talking about that symbolism and allowing that platform to create a dialogue with the client or someone who's getting their dream interpreted, it gets you thinking creatively and outside of the box, and ultimately it can lead to a discussion that has nothing to do with the dream. So sometimes the dream can reveal something, and it's an aha moment, and people are like, I really see the connection. I'm working, I'll interpret something that says something about work, and you're having a challenge with it, and you're fearful, and you're at dinner, and dinner means, whatever. And the person like, that makes sense because I'm thinking about changing my job, and, those kinds of things. And then the conversation can move forward, and it can be kind of enlightening, even if those particular interpretations of dream symbolism are not correct. So it's kind of a way, it's a tool to use to get that conversation going. So that's how I approach it when I'm doing that. And I have a link in here to an online version of the Dream Dictionary for you to play around with. And there you go. That's the my little thing about dream interpretation. I am going to offer, if any one of you in this class is interested, you have a dream you would like to kind of go through that process with me, I'd be glad to set up a Zoom meeting and do that with you one-on-one and kind of go through that process for free. And we can talk about that, and it'd be non-invasive. I'm not going to do that, tell me about all that's going on in your life, but maybe it'll be fun. Maybe it'll be interesting. So I'm going to offer that up to all of you. So here we have awake status. We have sleep status, in terms of our states, and we have those kind of defined by our circadian rhythms, that circle of rhythms. However, we also modify our consciousness through the use of substances. Now, we often see that as negative, but oftentimes it's positive. Medication. We might get medication to relax us. We might get medications to help us fall asleep. We might get medications to help us awake. And of course, then we have that line where we cross over into an abuse of those substances. So we don't call it alcoholism anymore, we call it substance use disorder. It's okay to use substances as long as it's in coordination with your doctor, as long as it's safe, as long as you understand the effects of it and take precautions. But there are certain drugs, for instance, that are far more harmful than they are helpful, and there are certainly individuals that get stuck in seeking those alternate states in order to essentially escape from reality, or to deal with stress, or they simply like it a lot and they just want to stay in that state. I'm not going to jump into the every person who's using substances has some hidden issues, although that's very often the case. But some people just like to be in that altered state, but then they're not really fully living the human experience. And there might be there will be psychosocial detriments from that point on. And for the most part, substance use, if it goes into substance use disorder, is a terminal disease. So this is a process that people die from. They eventually take too much, neglect other parts of their life, all kinds of ramifications. And the true level of diagnosis that we say, that when we say a person has a substance use disorder, is when an individual continues to use the substance inappropriately, regardless of the negative consequences. That's the angle. I mean, when we do something and we get negative consequences, we should go, whoa, I'm not going to do that again. What happens in substance use disorder is the individual experiences those consequences. They get pulled over, they get jail time, they lose their license, lose their job, lose their family, and they keep on using, even though those negative consequences resulted. So we look at that, and what I'm going to have you do is kind of research a particular drug and look at the addictive quality of it, and particularly looking at the neurology of it. How does this drug impact the brain? Because that's really where all of this action is happening. Sometimes, very often, in the limbic system, which is our pleasure center. That's where we generate pleasure, and certainly we're taking drugs for that. And one of the models of this is that our brain produces a lot of the drugs that are the same and produce the same effect that recreational drugs do. Just do it in small doses. What happens when we ingest too much of a substance, as kind of a general addiction model here, is that the natural part of the brain, consider it a factory that is producing a drug for the local community called your brain. And in comes this external source of a drug that takes care of things. So what happens to the town factory? It closes its doors. There's enough of this. There's no demand anymore because there's enough in the system. That individual, then that little factory in their brain that's producing that drug naturally, that factory goes out of business. In the absence of that drug, the person goes through withdrawal symptoms because not only do they have no external source for the drug, but the factory's still closed. You'd have to start up the factory, you have to unchain the gates, you have to retrain workers, you have to start up the machines, you got to do all this stuff, and that takes a while in the brain. So that period of time where a person can go through withdrawals and cravings for the drugs is the time when the external source of the drug stops and the internal production of the natural part of that drug system begins. And in fact, there's sometimes the factory won't start, and the individual has to face using external remedies. And this is where sometimes we see the controversial use of drugs to treat the addiction to narcotics. And say, well, it's just one drug for another, but one's controlled, one is prescribed, one is monitored. The individuals on that drug are able to oftentimes go back to work. They're able to function in society because the factory in their brain that produces that drug naturally is closed, but they're getting a substitute. Almost like, if you think about insulin, the mechanism that produces insulin in the pancreas might not be working well, so we need an external source to come in. We're not going to sit there and say, well, they shouldn't be on that because it's not natural. They're just changing one drug for another. Sort of the same thing. And so these are some of the controversial issues about substance use and whatnot, making my way through here. We have other states of consciousness that we may have experienced: hypnosis, highway hypnosis. When you're in Augusta, you're on your way to Bangor, and you can't even remember Newport. I won't make any jokes about the worthiness of remembering Newport, but anyway, you went right by it and you can't even remember it. And then I end off the chapter with a positive note on meditation, prayer, peak experiences. That's something that's going to come up when we talk about emotions. Peak experiences was something that was explored by Abraham Maslow, who also produced that hierarchy of needs, that triangle. Peak experiences are euphoric, feeling alive type of experiences. These are often sought at, and depending on your traditions, but drugs tend to bring us to feelings like that. And certainly in some native cultures, drugs are a part of achieving those peak experiences, but those are usually very ritualized and quite well supervised by shaman or individuals, that are guiding the individual through that visioning related to that drug. Not something that we should simply willy-nilly do on our own. But there are lots of ways in which people have peak experiences. Might be the birth of their child, might be a walk in the woods, might just be that deer that they saw one time on their backyard, or just sometimes just a euphoric feeling of feeling good when the sun is just at the right color and whatnot, those kind of things. All of that represents aspects of our state of consciousness. And so try and wrap our head all around that. So looking at our the expectations here, 2 discussions and 1 quiz. The first discussion is about sleep. Have you reflect about your own sleep patterns, healthy and not? And then we look at dreams. You are free to use that dream resource that I put on there to interpret your own dreams. The idea of this is, the idea of experimenting with this is to move away from a literal interpretation of the dream and to look at a symbolic interpretation of the dream based on that dictionary. Believe it or not, that's okay. It's just an activity to go through where instead of like, I was in my house because we're buying a house. There's that, kind of literal interpretation is like, no. Let's take that symbolic view of it. What's the house? It's your personality. What were you doing in the house? I was in the gym of the house. What does that mean? You can look up all this stuff and find the meanings, look at the emotional states that you're in within the dream, and maybe come up with a different interpretation of that. Again, I'm asking you to move away from the literal interpretation of your dream and experiment, play with the idea of symbolic interpretations based on the stuff that's in your dream and what the dictionary says about those things. And finally, with the quiz, I want you to straight ahead define consciousness. I said it earlier in this lecture. And then I want you to select a particular drug that's mentioned in the textbook or the course book and research the nervous system. What does it mimic? Drugs mimic neurotransmitters in your nervous system. So I want you to do that research. It might be, neurological processes of cocaine or neurological process, doing that kind of search. Doesn't have to be peer reviewed, but certainly valid sources kind of in there. And I want you to get the chemistry on this. Very important to see that there is a biology associated with this along with its effect on our consciousness. So that's it for today. It's been a little wacky here, kind of going around about lots of things to know about consciousness. Please read the textbook, read all that I've given out there, and I look forward to seeing you in those discussions.